Speaker.
Dr Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I rise on behalf of the Green Party to speak of some of the great crises and challenges that are facing the world and New Zealand at the moment. And I want to identify two in particular, what I would call the twin crises of inequality and climate change. Of course, we're all increasingly becoming familiar with both of these things, but I think it's important that we underline just how important they are to New Zealand and to the world. When it comes to inequality, what we've seen over the last 20, 30 years is a dramatic growth in inequality in New Zealand in particular, but globally as well. And as our societies have become more unequal, wealth has become concentrated in the top few percent, and the vast majority of people no longer own very much at all and have been stripped of most of their wealth as a result of the neoliberal reforms and the new right policies pursued by successive governments. There are now a great many New Zealanders who have no access to wealth whatsoever, which has been concentrated in a handful. On the other side of the coin, we have climate change. Now, the thing about climate change is that, of course, it's a global issue, but it does have very significant consequences for New Zealand as well. And I just want to start by talking about one of those, which is ocean acidification. What we found is that the acidification in the ocean has risen by about a quarter since pre-industrial times, so say over the last couple of centuries. The amount of acid in the ocean has increased by about a quarter as a result of all the carbon that's been emitted into the atmosphere. The carbon in the atmosphere, some of it dissolves in the ocean and means that the ocean is becoming increasingly acidic. The effect of that is that shellfish has a huge effect on shellfish and their ability to form shells. Ministry for Primary Industries recently produced a report saying that ocean acidification is a threat to our aquaculture industry. This is a $375 million a year industry, and it is directly affected by climate change, which is causing ocean acidification. Climate change in New Zealand has huge costs already, but it's only going to grow in time if we don't take action to do something about it. And today I want to talk a little bit more about climate change. Because how we respond to climate change, one of the greatest challenges of our generation, will define us as a nation. Climate change is a reality. The science is very clear that human-caused climate change is a scientific reality, but of course we have a government that's in denial about that reality. Yet climate change will affect every part of our lives, from how we grow food, in the case of ocean acidification, how we make our living, and of course as the sea level rises, as the ice sheets melt as a result of climate change, and also as the thermal mass of the water expands, then we will see rising sea levels which will inundate coastal communities in particular. We recently learnt that parts of the Antarctic ice sheet have begun an irreversible slide into the sea. It's about 160 billion tonnes of ice is being lost every year. Antarctica is literally shedding ice, and in spite of the denial of the current government in New Zealand, climate change is happening right in front of us. A recent report in the Dominion Post about Wellington's downtown streets, such as Lambton Quay, being turned into canals gives you a sense or a flavour of how it's going to affect us. Sea level rise is a dramatic problem. Now, of course, the current government says that we're such a small country that it won't make any difference, that we shouldn't do anything to cut our emissions because we're so small we can't take any effective action. In fact, the Prime Minister's favourite line is, we're only 0.2% of global emissions, what difference will it make? Which is of course exactly what you could say about voting in an election. If you took that attitude towards voting, you wouldn't vote. Of course, we know from the Dirty Politics book that the National Party doesn't want people to vote because they see it as a threat to their hold on the government. The thing is that National has completely failed to grasp the challenge of climate change. So far, under this government, New Zealand's net greenhouse gas emissions have increased by 20%. So at a time when we should be cutting our emissions to relate to the reality of climate change, in fact, the government is increasing New Zealand's emissions. Ministry for the Environment once again have produced a report which looks at the emissions going forward, and according to the Ministry for the Environment, New Zealand's net greenhouse gas emissions will increase by about 50% over a decade. So just think how grossly irresponsible is a government that has policies that will result in New Zealand's net greenhouse gas emissions increasing by 50%. Imagine if other countries in the world were as grossly irresponsible as the New Zealand government, where other countries were projecting to increase their net greenhouse gas emissions by 50% in a decade. Fortunately, most countries and most governments aren't as grossly irresponsible as the John Key government, but New Zealand is a major problem because we are an international player. And so when the New Zealand government goes out to the world and proudly tells everyone that it plans to increase New Zealand's net greenhouse gas emissions by 50%, it undermines international efforts to do something about it. It is in fact a national disgrace. The National Party rejects any proposals for a proper price on carbon, and so the Green Party and others have put forward proposals to put a proper price on carbon, which we know is the cheapest, most effective way to reduce New Zealand's greenhouse gas emissions, and yet the government has hollowed out the emissions trading scheme so that there's virtually no price and has weakened it to the point of redundancy, ensuring it is a failure. The ETS was designed to incentivise investment in clean technology, emission reductions and the planting of trees. It's done none of these things. In fact, it's done the opposite. New Zealand's net greenhouse gas emissions are projected to increase by 50% according to the Ministry for the Environment over the next decade. That is the hard reality of what's going on in New Zealand. It is embarrassing, it is farcical, it is a disaster for the climate. The government is giving away free permits to pollute. In fact, they've given away $1.3 billion of free permits to pollute under the emissions trading scheme. And when companies do pollute, rather than handing back these units, the big polluted companies have been selling them and then handing back cheap units that only cost 20 cents. So the government has enabled a flood of these units to come in from overseas. According to the Climate Change Minister, of course in this context it means the Minister for Accelerating Climate Change, Tim Grosser, National has chosen to stick with its completely ineffectual scheme, that is ineffectual at reducing emissions, very effective at increasing greenhouse gas emissions. They've chosen to stick with their scheme to increase greenhouse gas emissions because the National Party's base, the voters for the National Party, are not interested in action on climate change, according to Mr Grosser. At a pre-election climate voter event where I was there with him, he said that to many National Party supporters, climate change is nothing more than a United Nations conspiracy, a non-issue. But Tim Grosser is underestimating National supporters, and in doing so is abdicating responsibility for actually doing something. Instead of leading, National is actually taking New Zealand in exactly the wrong direction. Remember, the official statistics from the Ministry for the Environment say that under current policies, New Zealand's net greenhouse gas emissions will increase by 50% in a decade. A dramatic increase in emissions, a grossly irresponsible act. But the National Party has misjudged the people who voted for the National Party as well as everyone else, and eventually National's willful neglect will come back to bite them in all of us. They have a 20th century attitude on the climate, and it's not just a monumental failure on environmental policy, which of course it is. It's also a failure to grasp the economic opportunities of our times and a failure to understand where the global economy is going. The global economy is heading towards a cleaner, smarter economy. That's where it's going, a greener economy. Instead of being part of that, this current government is desperately trying to lock in 20th century technologies that have very high greenhouse gas emissions per unit, hoping to lock them in. The Green Party put forward alternative policies such as our climate tax cut, where we put a price on greenhouse emissions and all the revenue that's raised is returned in the form of tax cuts, both for individuals and for companies. Of course, the National Party completely rejected the climate tax cut, which was fiscally neutral, because of their desire to increase our greenhouse gas emissions by 50%, according to their own figures, over the next decade, increase in New Zealand's net greenhouse gas emissions. Just this weekend, the EU agreed to cut its emissions by 40% by 2030. And at next year's Global Summit in Paris, countries will have to commit to binding agreements. We cannot continue with the policy of this government of ever increasing greenhouse gas emissions. It's time to move into the 21st century, a century which will be marked by cleaner, smarter economics and governments that understand the science of climate change and actually cut greenhouse gas emissions instead of this government which is proposing to increase them. But that, I suspect, will require a change of government for us to move there.
I call the